Humour is a 1598 play by the English playwright Ben Jonson. The play belongs to the subgenre of the humorous comedy, in which each major character is dominated by an overriding humor or obsession. Benjamin Jonson, circa the 11th of June 1572, circa 16 August 1637, was an English playwright and poet. Jonson's artistry exerted a lasting influence upon English poetry and stage comedy. He popularized the comedy of humours. He is best known for the satirical plays Every Man in His Humour 1598, Volpone, or The Fox circa 1606, The Alchemist 1610, and Bartholomew Fair 1614, and for his lyric and epigrammatic poetry. He is generally regarded as the second most important English dramatist, after William Shakespeare, during the reign of James I. Major characters: Novel, an old gentleman. Edward Novel, his son. Brainworm, his servant. Master Stephen, a country girl. George Downright, a squire. Welberd, his half-brother. Justice Clement, an old magistrate. Roger Formal, his clerk. Thomas Kitely, a merchant. Dame Kitely, his wife. Mistress Bridget, his sister. Master Matthew, the town girl. Thomas Cash, Kitely's man. Oliver Cobb, a water-bearer. Tib, his wife. Captain Bobadil, a Paul's man. Summary. The play begins with a prologue setting out the playwright's aims. Firstly, Jonson seeks to give an accurate depiction of the deeds and language of Elizabethan London. Secondly, he wants to fill the play with characters that show an image of the times. If the play can achieve this portrait of popular errors, the audience will laugh at them and agree, there's hope left, that they may like men. Act 1 begins with old Noel asking Brainworm, his servant, to call his son, Edward. Old Noel is happy that Edward seems to be enjoying his studies, but worried that he is too preoccupied with idle poetry. Noel's nephew, Master Stephen, comes by and asks Noel if Edward has any books on hawking and hunting, to which Noel chastises his nephew for being wasteful. A servant brings a letter intended for Edward, but old Noel decides to read it secretly first. It is an invitation from a roguish London gallant, Welberd, bidding Edward to come on spend time in the old Jewry and generally make mischief. Its tone offends Noel. This prompts him to worry about the company his son keeps and consider whether he should actively intervene. Brainworm then delivers the letter to Edward and, instead of hiding the fact that old Noel has read it, tells Edward right away. Edward is delighted by the letter and plans to meet Welberd later with Stephen in tow. Elsewhere in the city, the buffoonish townsman, Master Matthew, calls on Captain Bobadil, a braggart soldier. Bobadil is lodging at the house of Cobb, a lower-class water carrier. Matthew quotes pretentiously from Thomas Kyd's Spanish tragedy and complains that Downright, Welberd's half-brother, recently insulted his fashion sense. Bobadil shows him some sword fighting techniques in an effort to prepare Matthew for any future altercation. Act 2 begins at the house of Kitely, a London cloth merchant. Kitely complains to Downright about the behavior of Welberd, who has been lodging with him. According to Kitely, Welberd has been keeping bad company and filling his house with lascivious jests. Matthew and Bobadil come by, looking for Welberd. They leave soon after learning that he isn't there. Downright gets increasingly angry about Welberd's reported behavior and finds Matthew and Bobadil highly irritating. As Cobb comes by to deliver water, Kitely begins to worry that he is being cuckolded. When Dame Kitely and his sister, Mistress Bridget, show up, he pretends that his distress is due to a fever. On London's moorfields, Brainworm enters disguised as a vagrant ex-soldier. He plans to follow old Noel, who is intending to spy on Edward, and relay any information he gleans back to the latter. When Edward and Stephen arrive, Brainworm stays in character and sells Stephen a sword. Stephen thinks his purchase is a good one, but in reality the sword is of poor quality. Soon after, old Noel comes by, wondering whether he ought to be intervening in Edward's life or keeping his distance. Brainworm appears, still disguised, and begs for money from old Noel. Brainworm announces his name is Fitzord. Old Noel is disapproving, but agrees to take on Brainworm as a servant, not realizing the man he is talking already is his servant. At the start of Act 3 in a nearby tavern, Bobadil tries to complain to Welbert about Downright, but Welbert refuses to hear anything bad said about his brother. Edward informs Welbert about old Noel's interception of the letter, and the two of them look forward amusedly to what might happen. They both mock Stephen, who insists on the extreme melancholy of his character without realizing he is the butt of the joke. Bobadil boasts about his previous war exploits and, taking a look at Stephen's sword, informs him that he has been ripped off. Brainworm comes by, Welbert and Edward laugh as Stephen tries to complain about his purchase. Brainworm reveals his true identity and informs Edward that his father is attempting to spy on him. Meanwhile, Kitely's jealousy and fear of being cuckolded are getting worse, so much so that he can't concentrate on his business. Eventually he leaves to complete a transaction, instructing his servant, Cash, to report to him immediately if Welbert and his entourage arrive at the house. Sure enough, the young gallants arrive soon. Welbert and Edward praise Brainworm for his absolute good jest. Welbert asks Cash if Kitely is inside. Cash lets slip that Kitely has gone to Justice Clement's. Bobadil lights some tobacco, praising its quality ridiculously. Cobb is offended by the smoke, causing Bobadil to beat him with a cudgel. Cash dispatches Cobb to recall Kitely, who bypass at the house of Justice Clement, the local legal authority. Act 4 starts back at Kitely's house, where Downright chastises Dame Kitely for allowing Welbert at the house. She protests that there's very little she can do about it. Mistress Bridget, Kitely's sister, Matthew, Bobadil, Welbert, Stephen, Edward, and Brainworm all come in. Edward and Welbert laugh as Matthew tries to woo Bridget with plagiarized lines of poetry. Downright enters in a fit of rage. When Welbert describes Matthew's behavior as tricks to Mistress Bridget, some of the characters take this as a sexual euphemism. Downright is especially irate and demands that Welbert leave, taking his entourage with him. They draw their swords, but are split up by the others. Kitely arrives, prompting the others apart from Downright to exit. Downright vents his frustration. Bridget, Dame Kitely, and Kitely try to calm him down. By now, Kitely is certain that he has been cuckolded, thinking that Welbert and the others are hiding in his house. He goes in to search for them. At Cobb's house, Cobb starts to suspect his wife, Tib, of cuckolding him. He orders her to stay inside and not admit any visitors, suspecting her of taking Bobadil as a lover. Meanwhile at the tavern, Edward and Welbert instruct Brainworm to take a message for them. Welbert announces his intention to help Edward marry Bridget. Brainworm, still in disguise, finds old Noel again in a street in the Old Jewry. The latter man is with Roger Formel, Justice Clement's assistant. Cunningly, he tells old Noel that Edward has discovered his father's plans to spy on him. Furthermore, he was involved in an altercation with Edward and his entourage earlier in the day. According to Brainworm, as Fitzord, Edward can be found cavorting with brave citizens' wives at the house of Cobb. Formel wants to hear about Fitzord's life and goes out with him to drink wine. Matthew, Edward, Bobadil and Stephen discuss Downright. Bobadil and Matthew promise to get back at him. Excited by this fighting talk, Bobadil brags once more about his heroic behaviors in battle, having seemingly been at all of the major ones of the previous years. Just then, Downright appears. He challenges Matthew and Bobadil, disarming the latter man with ease. Matthew runs away, leaving Bobadil to try and make excuses for his cowardly behavior. Stephen takes Downright's discarded cloak. Back at Kitely's house, Welbert explains Downright's angry actions as merely being his nature. Brainworm arrives, now dressed as Roger Formel, and tells Kitely that Justice Clement has summoned him. Kitely frantically searches for Cash and Cobb to act as sentinels while he is gone. Dame Kitely wonders why her husband is always searching for Cobb. Welbert craftily suggests that Cobb's wife, Tib, runs a brothel and facilitates Kitely's adultery. In her own fit of jealousy, Dame Kitely grabs Thomas and heads for Cobb's house. Welbert turns his attentions to Bridget, trying to persuade her to marry Edward. Kitely returns from Justice Clement, who hadn't sent for him, and, on hearing that his wife has gone to Cobb's, rushes there too. In a London street, Matthew and Bobadil encounter Brainworm, who they think is Roger. Formal and ask him for a warrant for Downright's arrest. In lieu of money, they give him jewelry and silk stockings. Brainworm tells the audience of his intentions to pawn these items to disguise himself as a sergeant to make the arrest. Noel arrives at Cobb's house, hoping to find Edward. Tib doesn't know what he's talking about. Kitely and Dame Kitely arrive, each thinking they will find the other in the act of adultery. Hearing of his wife's alleged behavior, Cobb beats Tib for her wrongdoing. They all resolve to go to Justice Clement to get his judgment on what has happened. Brainworm, disguised as a sergeant, encounters Matthew and Bobadil, who point them in the direction of Downright, except it's actually Stephen, wearing Downright's cloak. Downright does arrive soon, however, and agrees to be taken to Justice Clement, but only if Stephen goes too for stealing his coat. Old Noel, Kitely, Dame Kitely, Cash, Tib, and Cobb assemble at the irreverent Justice Clement's house. He quickly figures out that Noel, Kitely, and Dame Kitely have been duped, pointing out that both Kitely and his wife got their information from Welbert. Bobadil and Matthew arrive. Justice Clement is deeply unimpressed with the reports of Bobadil's cowardice. Clement is surprised to see Downright arrive with Brainworm and Stephen, mocking Downright for agreeing to be arrested without seeing an official warrant. At this point, Brainworm comes clean about his exploits, and also informs the group that Edward and Bridget are getting married. Instead of being angry, Clement is impressed by Brainworm's behavior, saying he deserves to be pardoned for the widow, the offense. Edward, Welbert, Bridget, and Roger Formal arrive. Clement congratulates the newlyweds, and also mocks Matthew's poetic pretenses. He orders there to be a merry feast to celebrate the marriage, and implores everyone to put off all the discontent. In high spirits, Clement talks about how the adventures of the day will be remembered and applauded for a long time into the future. Summary in brief. In general outline, this play follows Latin models quite closely. In the main plot, a gentleman named Noel, concerned for his son's moral development, attempts to spy on his son, a typical city gallant. However, his espionage is continually subverted by the servant, Brainworm, whom he employs for this purpose. These types are clearly slightly anglicized versions of ancient types of Greek New Comedy, namely the Cynics, the son, and the slave. In the subplot, a merchant named Kitely suffers intense jealousy, fearing that his wife is cuckolding him with some of the wastrels brought to his home by his brother-in-law, Welbert. The characters of these two plots are surrounded by various, humorous, characters, all in familiar English types: the irascible soldier, country gull, pretentious pot poets, surly water bearer, and avuncular judge all make an appearance. The play works through a series of complications which culminate when the Justice, Clement, hears and decides all of the characters' various grievances, exposing each of them as based in humor, misperception, or deceit. Johnson's purpose is delineated in the prologue he wrote for the folio version. These lines, which have justly been taken as applying to Johnson's comic theory in general, are especially appropriate to this play. He promises to present deeds and language such as meant to use skeptical smiley face and persons, such as comedy would choose, when she would show an image of the times, and sport with human follies, not with crimes. The play follows out this implicit rejection of the romantic comedy of his peers. It sticks quite carefully to the Aristotelian anatees. The plot is a tightly woven mesh of act and reaction, the scenes a genial collection of depictions of everyday life in a large Renaissance city. Works cited: Wikipedia, Litcart.